We take refuge in wisdom, compassion, and non-clinging awareness. We take refuge in the full richness of here. We take refuge in the ever-present immediacy of now. Truth is all-pervading. It is the thusness of this moment, the suchness that we are. My refuge is to live within the truth. For the sake of all beings, wisdom, compassion, non-clinging awareness. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. In the classical Theravadan Buddhist teaching, the Buddha sometimes speaks about the Dharma in terms of it being something that is realized by the wise, each for themselves. Right? The Dharma is to be realized. The truth of living, of our life experience, is to be realized by the wise, not to be realized by the inept, the kind of incomplete, the stupid, right? But to be realized by the wise, right? And this presents a massive problem for people who approach Buddhism, because usually when we approach Buddhism for the first time, we're feeling anything but wise. So it's basically hopeless. We haven't got a chance, right? Because we conceive, if you like, of maturing or growth or evolution very much with a metaphor of a kind of ladder. And you kind of climb up the ladder one rung at a time. You start at the bottom, you've got to have a good foundation. We even talk about this like foundation work, so everyone knows, okay, foundation work means basic stuff, because you're building a house, you've got to have good bricks and mortar and good foundation there, because if you build a big tall house without a good foundation, the wind comes, 3 little pigs, blows the house away, or maybe I'm muddling up my stories. Right? And we have this sense that somehow we're going to approach enlightenment or wisdom, right, through practice. We're going to get to wisdom. That's the whole goal, is to get to wisdom. Okay? And last week, I was playing, or last Sunday, last time we met, I was playing with this idea of equating this central word in Buddhism, bodhisattva, with a kind of nilogism of eco-sattva, right? Someone who's like embedded in the murmurations. Remember we were talking about the murmurations of the starlings, the birds flying and like swirling smoke. And you begin to realize that our whole of our life is a kind of a murmurating, if you like. The cells are responding to other cells, organs responding to cells, whole clusterings of systems, right, responding to other whole clusterings of systems. Right? This whole kind of dancing that's going on here. Right? And we talked about the path of the eco-sattva. And we began to explore this question of beginning with this kind of intuitive sense that things are truly interconnected. Right? How then should we live? Good morning.
Good morning.
Come in, I see you managed to somehow get by the house.
I finally found it.
Please come in and have a seat. often when the six parami are being taught in Buddhism, they're taught like a ladder. Right? So at the beginning, when you're too kind of ignorant or unquestioning or dull or uninspired to do anything else, at least practice generosity. Right? And then out of the generosity perhaps starts to come a little bit more wholesome relating. And then perhaps out of that starts to grow a bit of patience. And then maybe out of that you might start to have a little bit more kind of directedness in deciding what you're going to do with your life energy. And then you can begin to meditate. Right? And then the meditation, of course, leads to prajna, right? Wisdom. And I was reflecting the other day on different ways of looking at this than that traditional ladder system. Right? Because quite often in the Mahayana tradition, if we do speak about that progression, we usually do it twice. Right? So you finally get up to wisdom and you go, now it's time to really look at Dharma-parami. Right? So you now, to be realized with wisdom, the wise, right? Imagine for a moment, we say wisdom, compassion, and non-clinging awareness. Imagine for a moment that you were reminding yourself of the six parami. Right? Wisdom also means knowledge. In terms of process, we might talk about it as sublime understanding. Okay? It's like so profound, it's ungraspable. This is this wisdom, this knowledge. And so we need knowledge. It's not a kind of mindless, unthinking path. Right? We in a sense begin with some knowledge, with some kind of, some degree of understanding. Okay? And that wisdom, compassion, right? And compassion really means, is the root of compassion, right? It's like focused, understanding, communion with others. There's no compassion without an ability to attend to what you're doing. So strangely enough, you see, compassion also in Buddhism is sometimes karuna. Sometimes it's translated as empathy. Sometimes it's translated as compassion. And sometimes it's rendered as skillful means. Right? So actually we need knowledge and skillful means. And to be one-pointedly rooted, right? Samadhi in skillful means. So that when I make a cup of tea, I do it as an expression of skillful means. This is compassion in action. And then finally we have non-clinging awareness, or non-clinging responsiveness, as I like to think of it sometimes. So the word awareness is so loaded for many people that I think it's useful to throw in an alternative. So you may, awareness, yeah, it is got something to do with responsiveness, right? And you begin to realize that responsiveness happens at your being at very unconscious levels, which would seem to indicate that maybe even awareness could happen at unconscious levels. That maybe I am a dancing of responsiveness. Maybe I am a dancing of awareness. And my job perhaps in Dharma is to appreciate this. And to appreciate that this applies to everyone. And so we have knowledge, right? It's kind of sublime understanding. We have skillful means, right? And we have, right? It's interesting because that's Sila. I mean, that's Prajna, Sila. I mean, Prajna, Samadhi, right? And the last one, Sila, because remember last week again I was quoting from the Visuddhimagga, the inner tangle and the outer tangle. This generation is entangled in a tangle, so pray Gautama, who can untangle this tangle? Okay? And the Buddha responded in a very kind of succinct and very simple way, and then elaborated through the rest of the text, right? A being who's well grounded in Sila, Samadhi and Prajna, or Prajna, Samadhi and Sila, is such a being. This is how we untangle it, right? And Sila could be translated, it's a kind of a, when we in our hippie days in the 1960s, we were all dedicated practitioners of Sila, and you could tell that because we were always going around saying, "That's cool, man," and Sila means to cool, right? And then after a while, the world became really defiled, and it became uncool to be cool, right? And so nobody said cool anymore, and it sounded really weird. And now the wheel has turned, and everyone's come back to it, and they say, "That's cool, hey, cool," right? Right? And imagine for a moment that they realized that what they were actually saying was Sila. Right? And wholesome relating has something to do with the remaining 4 parami. Right? It has to do with generosity. This is like wholesome relating. Right? It has to do with the 5 Wholesome Life Trainings, which we'll speak about. Right? It has to do with patience. It has to do with skillful use of our energy. Right? So every time you actually go, for the sake of all beings, wisdom, compassion, and non-clinging awareness, you might find it useful to occasionally reflect that you're also going Prajna, Samadhi, and Sila, and you're also going the 6 parami, and you're reflecting, or you're bringing to mind perhaps the manner of living of an eco-sattva, a being who's in tune, right, with this whole. The other day we get a few internet subscriptions to, I think it's a magazine called Aeon. Is that it, Mary?
Yes.
Is it?
Aeon and Emergence.
Aeon, yeah. And the other day every week or 2 weeks or something, they send you out a few pieces, interesting pieces. And there was a video link on it, which I watched. It was very short, and it was this person. It was done with computer graphics and someone talking, and they were just talking about the interconnectedness of everything. And it was a very beautiful sort of visual presentation, cosmic dimensions and cells and swirling lights and everything. And this is a person who was just talking about it as if we all know this. Right? That this is kind of common knowledge. Right? And it's common knowledge now. Not when I say common knowledge, obviously there are a lot of people who seem to be trying their utmost to ignore this. Right? But there's a lot of people who it's not a great, huge, gigantic, challenging thought that we're somehow interconnected. Not now. And it's not a challenging thought that we're profoundly interconnected. Right? And the thing is that we kind of know this in a good moment. Have you noticed this? Right? That there are sometimes you're just having this sense of, it's almost like a blessing of the knowing in the cells of your being, of this profound interbeingness of everything. And it's a good moment. Is it not? And then the doorbell rings. Or your messaging service goes ping, and there's a message on your phone, right? Or your email comes in or something, and then all of a sudden the good moment doesn't seem to be there, right? And what's left is something different, disconnectedness, right? Sense of separation, sense of otherness, sense of challenge of how on earth I'm going to maneuver myself with this otherness. So the question that an eco-sattva, I mean a kind of more mature eco-sattva might begin to realize or to raise for themselves is, here I am. I've been practicing Dharma for years and years and years. I've had many, many moments of feeling utterly blessed with a profound, sublime sense of understanding, right, of interconnectedness. And yet there are still many dissonant moments in my living. And we're kind of faced with this kind of discrepancy between our intuitive knowing and maybe too much of our practical living, so to speak. Does anyone relate to what I'm saying? Right? I mean, I'm not trying to be, like super duper sophisticated or anything. I'm trying to address something which I believe is probably a shared experience of most of us who are gathered together in one way or another this morning. It's here.
What I feel is that like a peripheral knowing, and then there's a focused attention. We're not really separate.
Yeah. So really what I'm trying to raise here is the possibility that holding this question of how I might, of this kind of, it's not even a question, it's an aspiration to somehow bring my living more and more in tune with my kind of intuitive moments for the sake of all of us. Because it's really clear to me that I'm a better person to be with when I'm in a blessed state of, it doesn't mean you know everything. Sublime understanding doesn't imply that you know everything. The knowledge of Prajna doesn't imply that you know everything. Right? Because the next moment's unknowable. It's just like this is like vast. But this kind of edge, if you like. I like this idea of sublime understanding, because it's like the sublime is almost like on the edge between like absolute wonderment and total terror. It's like it scares the hell out of you, because the implications of this are like, what on earth's going on? And you realize you don't have a dicky bird. And yet at that very same moment, you feel kind of like somehow this is quite extraordinary, because you recognize this is life and it's been going on with life, and I'm much closer to kind of moving with this. And so with this, we have a certain degree of wisdom. So we're now ready to start to practice Dharma. After all this time, to be realized by the wise, each for themselves. We've got a bit of wisdom going, just enough to get going. And the wisdom is to actually acknowledge that this kind of dissonance between my intuitive sense of goodness and well-being and the times when that's really gone and I'm just running around like a bull in a china shop, right, is increasingly unsatisfactory to the point where I want to do something about it. we spoke a little bit about the parami of Dana last time. And this time I'd like to speak about the parami of Sila. Okay? And I'd like to do that partly as a meditation and partly as just a kind of a raising of question. Okay? There are many ways we could approach this, but one of the ways is to utilize, right, as a kind of a reminder, as a kind of a sort of guideline for this contemplation, what I'm increasingly thinking of as the Five Wholesome Life Trainings. Okay. Initially, when I first began to kind of think along this line, it was more like the 5 precepts in positive expression. But it's too limited in many people's minds. They don't even go there. They're not interested. This is Buddhist. I'm not Buddhist. I'm not interested in Buddhist stuff. Or it's kind of like ordination or vows or morality or judgment and all kinds of stuff on your behavior. And so let's introduce this differently, right? If we say the positive expression, then immediately it raises the question, well, what about the negative expression? Right? And then it gets terribly complicated. Right? So just feel for a moment, right? These 5 wholesome life trainings. And I'm still working on refining the kind of verbal expressions of these. And so I'm going to just remind myself of, as I keep shifting it a little bit, right? But I think that the reason why I shift is because there's always a kind of problem, right, with the people find with some of the older expressions. So, for example, the first precept, right, which is, I undertake to train myself not to take the life of any living beings. And then you get an ant infestation in your house, and you wonder, what am I going to do? Right? And so you say, well, I'm not going to take life, so I'm going to stop eating. You know, because you realize that every time you eat, you're taking it. So in a sense, like, it doesn't kind of work. You're saying this thing over and over again, knowing full well that you're going to fail in this. It's just impossible. Right? So I think actually it's much better to have a spiritual discipline that feels possible. The possible we can work with. The impossible we can't work with. We say, well, we don't really mean not taking life. We really mean non-harming. And, you know, and what we really mean is non-harming all the people that we like. But harming, and they're not even human, so we can wipe them out. You know, how can we have wars? How can we have genocide? You know, how can we be Christians? Thou shalt not kill. Right? And continue with the life that we're living. Impossible. Right? You might as well say, I am a sinner. Right? End of story. Yeah. Right? I will train myself to support and appreciate the interbeing nature of all living beings. I will live with a sensitive and responsive awareness to the whole ecology of life. Now, using these as themes for meditation, it's simply to use this as a reminder, right? And then you go, yeah, oh, I got it. And now we sit down. Right? Just do this right now. I will train myself to support and appreciate. Right? I used to say the lives of all living beings. Didn't like that too much because poetically it didn't work, lives and living is a bit repetitive and so on. But then again, you got the problem with the ant invasion. And what happens if some of the lives that are dancing in your continuum are called cancer cells? As far as we're going to, right? I don't know if I can do that. So have you ever had this one? I don't know if I can really appreciate. Some people say, oh, I can appreciate the life of all living beings. I just can't stand spiders. Right? You know what I mean? Like we got our little thing. I used to be like that with leeches. I must say, all the creatures, all interesting, wonderful creatures all over the world. But kind of the leeches gave me the kind of the, right? It wasn't until finally I had profound teaching in northwestern Tasmania. There's some kind of forest down the coast there, and you kind of go up there and you go walking in these forests, and you end up with not just one or two leeches. You end up with 100 or 200 leeches, right? And there's so many of them, and after so many days of just kind of, you get skilled at picking them off, and after a while, finally you go, actually, it's not such a big deal, and you can sort of pick them off, and right? So it's possible to kind of deal with your spider phobia, right? But here it's not asking you that, this kind of lives. It's the interbeing nature of all living beings. I will support and appreciate the interbeing nature of all living beings, right? So let's just sit for a moment and support and appreciate the interbeing nature of your own living beingness. You can experiment with it in movement. Right? Well, I won't do it because it's rude. I could pick my nose or something like this, you see. I mean, there's movement, right? That we're right? It's like, why do I stick my finger in my ear and scratch it around there? It's like there's an interbeingness of sensation and feeling and expectation and pleasure and all sorts of things, right? This precept is not an invitation to stop doing things and live under control and make sure you do it all right. This precept is actually an invitation to explore the life and living that you are through this lens, right? The interbeing nature of all living beings. I will live with a sensitive and responsive awareness for the whole ecology of life, the whole interbeingness that is living. You see, we might think that this is just a kind of, this is a Sila, and then later on we can get onto Samadhi, and finally we get to Prajna. But surely we could also approach this from, first of all, some prajna, some wisdom, a kind of intuitive sense of this, and now I'm going to put this into action. How does this affect the way we do things? It affects the choices we make in the shop. It affects the way we drive the car. It affects the way we garden and the way we greet our neighbor. Right? Is there anything more profound than this? Right? I will train myself. I will train myself. It's not I will float around and hope that the revelation of the interbeing nature of all living beings will bless me. Right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good beginning point, but I'm assuming that we're beyond that beginning point. We've been in this for quite a few years. Now, some of you have probably moved on from this, and you remember back when you used to do this, but now you've got much more profound things to do. But I'll confess to you that after it's nearly 50 years now of involvement with Buddha Dharma, I'm kind of finding that this is almost more than I can handle. Right? I like to keep it simple. Smiling and breathing and present and supporting and appreciating the interbeing nature of all living beings. And living with a sensitive and responsive awareness. This is not a sort of, I will not do this and I'm going to, next time I see them, I'm going to do that differently, and that. It's the sensitive and responsive awareness is in the minutiae of moment by moment of reaching, of stretching, of burping, of sneezing, of talking, of engaging. This is the path of the eco-sattva, right? To make this interbeing nature of living real. I'd like to talk about each one of these 5, right? But before we skip to the next one, I'd like to just ask, are there any questions or observations on this? This is a massive life involvement. It's so much more than just a precept that you recite maybe once a day, or once a month, or once a year, or once in a blue moon. Right? And then you forget about it and get on with your living and hope for the best. This is like I look around and I see we need training in eco-sattvaship on this planet. Right?
Tarchin,
Yes.
so you just said, what I heard you say was, we need to make this real. So then, my question is, it is real, whether I think I'm making it or not.
Nope, that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I say we need to make this intention to realize this real in our being. Right? We're not talking about the reality of life. We're talking, you live with intention. Mm-hmm. You didn't just kind of drift here and then suddenly wake up and find yourself in our living room. Right? Everything you do has some kind of intention. It may be confused, it may be you don't understand it, and so on. We're not talking about the interbeing. Our intuition says it's all interbeing. Our living reveals many moments when we live as if we're not realizing that.
Yes.
We're not appreciating that. That's what we're talking about. I will train myself to appreciate and support more and more. We're not arguing over or questioning that, the whole universe, Rinpoche used to sometimes say, whole universe utterly pure. And I mean, at that point he kind of walk out of the room, and it's a good job he didn't. Otherwise, he could have said that and then just popped off and said that, what else is there to say? It's true. But we're not talking about something being true. We're talking about how we live. And you've got to have a major step for the bodhisattva is to have the honesty to stop BSing ourselves. Right? And getting, and sort of almost like, well, I kind of know it's all interconnected and so on, so, what can we do? I will train myself. How do I train myself?
That was the question I was going to ask.
This is the question you have to find out the answer to. I'm saying as much as I possibly can say towards this. I didn't say you will train yourself to support and appreciate the lives of all. So I don't have a clue what you're going to do.
No.
Say, I will train myself.
So you've got to find your own path.
The
own way.
Dharma is to be realized by the wise, each for themselves. No one can tell you what it is. Right? It doesn't mean that no one can help you. Right? In the interbeingness of our lives, we synergize each other and so on. But in a way, it's like we're invited here. I'm inviting you, right, to take these kind of themes of contemplation to heart and live with them. Let them, like, not only do you contemplate these themes, but these themes template you. You get shaped into it's a different type of being who lives like very close to the surface. In other words, it keeps on coming up many, 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 many times. This kind of deep aspiration to support and appreciate the interbeing nature of all living beings. And you can't do this unless you raise the question of what interbeing nature? You don't just accept this and think it's something you have to do. You go, what on earth do I mean by... Some people say, well, yeah, I get the interbeingness a little bit, but, in these areas where I'm definitely disconnected. I've got nothing to do with them. It's not my business.
It's like, what do we mean by training?
Yeah, what do we mean by training? I will train myself. I will consciously encourage a habit pattern in my being of supporting and appreciating. How do I train myself to ride a bicycle? What am I actually doing in training? Right? You're doing it kind of again and again, usually with variations, depending on what you meet in the process. Like you're learning to ride a bicycle, and you don't do exactly the same thing over and over again until you can ride it, because it's impossible to learn to ride a bicycle without riding it. Maybe this is not true, but I've yet to meet someone who can convince me that they read a manual on bicycle riding, first of all, had never seen a bicycle in their life, and then on the basis of reading the manual on the bicycle, they just were hired by Cirque du Soleil. Right? It doesn't happen. Right? It requires a certain degree of training. Right? In the sense, right? Training. Right? Conditioning. I'm going to condition myself to be a loving, sensitive, responsive person. You got to get rid of all your conditioning. Right? Habits. Right? I'm recognizing that I was born into the world with a kind of a tendency to certain types of habits, certain types of habits of metabolism, certain types of habits of hair coloration, right? We call this inheritance and genetics and so on. What happens if you suddenly find yourself, the person has fetal alcohol syndrome? They didn't ask for this. And yet, in a sense, they're already kind of well trained in it. They're entrained by it. Choicelessly, right? Certain kinds of vulnerabilities of metabolism are there in their system. Right? And it came about not through just one thing. It came about through a lineage of activities, right? And we kind of build tendencies. Cecily Quiet once said, if you do something once, it's a habit. She sometimes liked to say these outrageous things. And I thought that was pretty good, actually. That really deserved a bit of thinking, right? Because it's almost like we're entraining. We could talk about entraining the nervous system to spark, cells, neurons, synapses right, to spark in certain frequencies and sequences and patternings, right? And so you become really good, well trained. I'm kind of really good at fear. I do fear really well, you know. Like Cirque du Soleil, if they had an act which was like, you know, this kind of world-class fear, I'd get hired, right? I'm trying to like look at it in the large. Everything we do, our breathing is habituated, right? You breathe in, you breathe out. You breathe in. That silly story, I don't know where it came from, but Rinpoche told it once about the guy with the headset. He wore the earphones and went to the barber for a haircut. And he insisted that the barber cut his hair without taking the earphones off. And the barber said, well, that's crazy. Like, why is that? How come it's really hard to cut your hair without taking these huge earphones off? And he said, well, if you do that, I'll die. Right? And the barber thought, that's great. This guy's insane. You know, this is kind of completely ridiculous. And so you know, halfway through the haircut, he couldn't stand it anymore. He thought, this is like, and he took the earphones off really quick, and the guy in the chair just dropped dead. Very funny joke, right? And so he thought, well, how did that happen? So he put the earphone up to listen to what the person was listening to on the earphones. This is back in the days of these kind of guided meditation and self-help things, you know. And the voice said, breathing in, breathing out. And so he said, breathe out, and then he took the earphones off, and there was not, you know. I mean, there's all kinds of habits there, right? There's habitual ways of using our eyes. There's habitual, we're training, right? And then gradually, we start to see that in one sense, there's an awful lot of habit patterns that we just find ourselves with. You know, we can come up with all sorts of explanations, genetics, inheritance, conditioning, whatever you like. But the fact is that they're there. But then we also realize that to a degree, we can also choose to accentuate and train ourselves in, like, by accentuating particular patterns and not accentuating other patterns, right? So in that sense, we can participate in the training. I will train myself to be realized by the wise, not because the universe is already this way, but because this being is themselves putting the effort in to making it real for them. Because when it's not real for you, it doesn't matter that you kind of, like, I know it's all interconnected, but I'm feeling totally abandoned and totally disconnected. Not good enough. Yeah, this is what we're talking about. So sometimes, for example, you might find yourself, like, this is the advantage of these kinds of prayers or vows or what have you, is they're kind of in a very short little space of words. They remind us of something which is very profound and something that we feel we can work with. Okay? On another day, we might be working with the second one. I will train myself to dwell more and more in the mind of spontaneous generosity. What is the mind of spontaneous generosity? You know, like when I'm pouring the cup of tea and then something happens and I find myself continuing to pour the cup of tea as it overflows onto the table. Okay? And I go, well, where's the mind of spontaneous generosity now? How does that express itself in such a situation? How does the mind of spontaneous generosity express itself when I've just got cut off by a car in front of me? Not a house, a car, right? Right? And, you know, then they cut you off and you have to swerve, right? Like, what do we mean by a mind of spontaneous generosity? Right? How's that by, I will I will train myself to cultivate the mind of spontaneous stinginess. Right? A kind of mind of stinginess. How's that different from a mind of generosity, right? And this one is so huge that actually it is one of the parami on its own. This is dana parami. Okay? Daily I will give material support, emotional support, and an example to others of awakening in action. And some days you'll find that, I mean, often for me, these are still really very functional and useful working edges. But I don't do the whole, it's too much. That's just too much. I just go, emotional support. Okay, we'll work on that. That'll keep me busy for a while. You know, don't go, I'm going to give material support. Go, what is material? Like, these are invitations to question. You question the meaning of the whole thing. What do I mean by material? And then that's somehow connected with interbeing nature of all living beings. Where does life begin and where does it end? You know, it's the interbeingness. For example, the astronauts who go up to the space station, they have to ride exercise bicycles or treadmills and stuff like that if they stay out there for a long, long time, because otherwise they get quite severe osteoporosis. Right? And I can remember the photographs of a Russian cosmonaut who was like the first human to be in space for something like 8 months or 9 months or so. It was an incredibly long time in this weightless, gravity-free environment. And then they showed, you know, the picture of down came the capsule, you know, and out he came, and there was a photograph of him, and he's kind of like lying back like this, almost like in a human-shaped egg carton. You know how you got the egg cartons, you know, well, so you put the egg in. Well, imagine you kind of put spray, I don't know what, paper mache, cardboard, around the outline of the body, so that when you just sit back in there, you're completely and utterly supported in that. And even his face looked like flat, you know, and his whole organism had got kind of habituated to living in a gravity-free field. And you know, with the NASA program and with the Space Lab and so on, lots of speculation started to take place. And of course, some people assume you're speculating about these astronauts going up there, and next thing you know, they're speculating, what happens if, you know, I mean, we don't see what they do. Maybe they'll have sex in space. Imagine sex in a gravity-less field. Wow, that'd be... So lots of fantasies about all of this. But then if you got that and you stay up there for more than 9 months, you might have a baby born. That's the next step of the fantasy, right? People didn't want to go to that step. We just stay with the sex step itself, you know. But then we get up, because they're mostly men, you know, in the NASA program, and all these engineers and everything. You could imagine them having these thoughts. And then so they sort of imagined a baby being born in a gravity-free environment. And then the biologists got involved. And it's kind of an interesting speculation. And they forgot about the sex part and got interested in the biology. And they started to imagine that actually, if their long bones would probably grow a lot longer and much narrower. And so you'd have like some of these kind of E.T., you know, extraterrestrials that we see in the Hollywood movies, these, you know, really tall, skinny, anorexic space beings, right? Right? And so you would come down and your bones would snap. And it was a question of whether it would be possible, like if we send people to Mars, will the next generation of Martians ever be able to return to Earth? Okay? And we start to see that my body is in an interbeing relationship with the entire gravitational field of the planet Earth. The density and the shape of my bones is actually in relationship with the mass of the planet. Now, we don't normally think of the mass of the planet as being alive. That's physics. That's just a kind of a physical phenomena, right? And so we have the kind of the living being inextricably linked with the non-living being, the inorganic, so much so that we begin to perhaps raise the question, is like, where does the living end off and the non-living begin, or the non-living end off and the living begin? And after a while, maybe we shrug our shoulders and give up and say, well, we might as well call it all living, because the living wouldn't happen without all of it. Right? And so we're back to, I will train myself to give material support. You know, does this support, I give you an object. Am I giving you the object, or am I giving you the joy in your mind or in your emotional field? Well, you can't separate them out. Or the sense of obligation, or the sense of regret or disappointment, or all the stuff that happens at Christmas. You know, you're supposed to have a holiday at Christmas, but all the therapists have to work overtime. You know, sort of dealing with all the kind of family traumas of didn't give enough, gave too much, you know, all this kind of messy thing. And we begin to see that all we were giving was material stuff, but it seems to have a profound effect on mental stuff. So what does it mean to give material support? Could I give material support that's not emotional support? What do I mean by emotional support? Right? I will give, like daily, I will give material support, emotional support, and the example of my own life and living as an example of awakening in action. Right? Could I do this when no one's watching? Secretly. It's kind of embarrassing to say, oh, I'm giving you an example of my life as an example of awakening in action. Pretty good, eh? Right? So you're probably only going to be able to approach this secretly when no one's watching. What would it mean to be, what is awakening? And what's the connection between awakening and this kind of ever-evolving interbeing nature? But we dealt with this. We dealt with this last Sunday. Let's move to the next one. I will train myself to use the senses to further awakening, explore Dharma, and to come to know the world more profoundly and more compassionately. Okay? And, you know, what are the senses if they're not spaces or expanses of sensitivity? Sensible, you know, there's a kind of sensitivity, sensibleness, senses, right? But we say the senses are our door. The senses are our sensitivity. Right? So how many sensitivities do you have? You know, we say, oh, traditionally the five senses, right? So there's seeing, right? And there's hearing, and there's smelling, and tasting, and touching. Nowadays there's lots and lots of people who've only got three senses. You know, three senses plus serious COVID, long COVID, right? I was just reading about some woman who 2.5 years down the line, she still has no taste and a tiniest bit of smell coming back. Right? And we sometimes treat the five senses, right, as being kind of, I don't know, we talk about sense doors in Buddhism. In Buddhism, we don't talk about 5 sense doors. We talk about 6 sense doors. And we say, well, the door is a kind of it's a metaphor, obviously, eh? I mean, you could make a funny little cartoon and show a person like a cuckoo clock or something, and they're, you know, instead of having eyelids that come down like this, the eyelids go cuckoo, cuckoo, right? And you kind of look, and then you don't look, right? Or you taste, and then you don't taste. Doors, we know what a door is, right? But actually, do we really realize a door is not just for coming in through? A door is also for going out through. And in this, in experiences of being sensitive, it's a kind of it's very, very difficult for my right hand to touch my left hand without my left hand touching my right hand, right? And so just speaking very, very generally, not getting all kind of conventional, right? That when we are sensing the world, we also have a sense of being touched. We touch the world and we have a sense of being touched by something. There's feelings in us in response. It's almost as if the thing's reaching into you and mucking around with you, right? And it's almost as if you're reaching out to see. Imagine for a moment, not I will train myself to use the 5 sense blobs, this kind of jelly blob, float 2 of them up here called eyeballs, right? Or little curly Q nautilus shells in the side of your head called ears, right? Not use these senses, but what if it's I will train myself to use my sensitivity, right? And you begin to realize in Buddhism we have, as I say, they touch on the traditional 5 senses, but they also call the 6th sense is the mind door. And so the eye door is this kind of metaphorical sense of something where the sensitivity to light goes out and comes in, right? The ear door is where a kind of sensitivity to sound comes out and goes in. They're not actually just talking about these flaps on the side, because actually you hear with your whole body. Right? I mean, we live out in the country now, so I don't experience this so much, but when I do go into town and I experience this, and I realize it's not an uncommon experience, but because it's unusual for me, I find it really quite striking, no pun intended. And you're driving into town, and then another car, you stop at a stoplight, and then another car comes up beside you, and all of a sudden you realize you're sitting in your car, just nice and quiet, contemplating the day, and suddenly you go boom, 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 and you realize that the car beside you has these kind of subwoofers or whatever they're called, and like beating out this, heavy duty noise, right? That's coming boom, 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 right? And I'm not sure that I'm hearing that with my ear. I feel like I'm hearing it with my whole rib cage, with my belly. Sometimes it's really loud. It's like my toes curl up. Right? Right? So the mind door, right? If there's the sense doors are like sight coming in and experiences of going out to sight and having sight come in. Experiences of going out to sound and having sound come in. Sensitivities, right? Because we have that. We're talking about the phenomenological experience of the sensing, not a kind of anatomical description of a cluster of cells. It's the experience of sensing, right? Touching. How many touches do we have? There was a book that we used quite extensively in the 1970s. I've forgotten what it was called. It might have been called something like The Magic of the Senses, but it may have been some other book. But I remember in that book, the author listed, he said, well, we've got rods and cones in your eyes, so that's 2 senses. Because he's adding it up, Somehow he did his arithmetic with it, and he came up with, he enumerated 42 different senses. Right? There's the sensitivity of our organism in action. The sensitivity of the organism in action. The mind door, right, is not what light it's a sense of reaching out to thoughts or having thoughts come in. Right? This is another realm of sensitivity. And the thing that's really difficult is, imagine for a moment you've got a big sort of ball there with, a house with 6 doors in it. And so the eye door opens, right? And some light comes into God knows what happens inside the ball, right? But strangely enough, at the same time, have you ever had this before? You see something and have a thought at the same time? I mean, so the thought door opens and a thought comes in, and then they do things together. The thought seems to affect the sight or the hearing or the feeling, and the feeling seems to affect the thought. Right? And the summation of this is the next moment. You in the next moment, different from the previous moment. Right? And so we're training ourselves to be interested in this kind of field of sensitivity. Where does it begin? Where does sensing begin? Where does it begin at the tree? And then goes into my eye. And when you're in deep absorption through the 5 senses, do you ever see a tree?
Yes.
Right?
I see things.
Yeah, but your eye does not see trees. Your eye sees light. The sense of seeing the tree is a thought. Right? And does the thought, imagine for a moment that you're walking down the road and you see someone coming towards you. You say, "Hey, John, how you doing?" "Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. It's not John." Right? And at that moment, when you got so far, it actually triggers you to act. And then afterwards you realize you called it a mistake. You say, "Oh, I made a mistake." At that moment when you saw John and said, "Hey, John, that wasn't a mistake. You were seeing John." You couldn't tell the difference between that and actually seeing John. You didn't go, "Oh, hi, John," and John says, "Hi, how are you doing?" And you go, "Oh, I didn't make a mistake." You're just in the flow of the experiencing. Now, you didn't ask for this, but whether you like it or not, a living being is a sensitive being. If you don't explore your senses and see what they do and how they work with each other, then you're not exploring your living. And if you're a living being who's not exploring living, I wonder what on earth is it even possible? I will train myself to use the senses to further awakening. What do I mean by awakening? Today I mean curiosity, awakening curiosity, right? Today I mean deep understanding, deepening understanding of interbeing nature. Oh, first precept. Oh, or is this generosity to give right? There are these 5 different trainings, or are they 5 different facets of how an eco-sattva would naturally live their realization? It's almost like let's imagine that we're radiant beings, that we're actually realized beings, and pretend. Right. Ages ago, I was in London and I was staying with Ros Langdon she had a flat in Putney, and I'd be giving a few classes in her flat, and then during the day I didn't really have much to do, and I was busy being a dedicated monk, and so it was a little bit kind of noisy in the flat. It's kind of fridge and stuff happening and street noise, because I seem to remember it was up a few floors, so I picked up a lot of street noise. And they had a tiny little yard in the backyard, and I remember I used to go down and I found there was a great big bush, huge bush, and I found that there was a little hole in it. I could crawl into the bush, right, and I could sit in meditation gloriously on the earth, right, and no one could see me. So this became my meditation place, so I'd go out and sit in there. I was sitting there doing my thing. Right? One day I came out, I started crawling out, and there was someone standing there when I'm crawling out of the bushes, right? And it was an extraterrestrial. He was like a little being from outer space. He was about that tall, had sort of silver head and antennas coming out the top, and kind of silver boxy arms and legs and so on. And my first thought was like, I just went, oh, like I was just like, I really met it actually in innocence for a split second. And then a split second later, I realized it was the little boy who lived in the flat downstairs dressed up in his spaceman outfit. Right? And I was thinking about this little boy, playing being a spaceman, and I wondered if he eventually became an astronaut for NASA. We play our way into our talents. Why don't we play being awakening beings? Okay. I will use my sensitivities, all 6 sensitivities, all 42 sensitivities, all of them equally valuable, all of them inseparably part and parcel of the life and living that I am. Right? Not these senses are dwelling in the here and now, and that's distraction. It's hard, it's difficult, it's subtle, but this is a practice for the wise to realize the Dharma, each for themselves. It's not, the starting point on the ladder is stop thinking, don't have thoughts, wandering, come back to the meditation. In the seeing, there's just the seeing. I had so much difficulty with that. Rinpoche seemed to quote it all the time. Sometimes I thought he did it just to irritate me. Right? He said, in the seeing, there's just the seeing. In the hearing, there's just the hearing. And so I tried desperately to just see. I want the pure just seeing. I don't want any muddled up with thinking or remembering or feelings or smellings or taste. It's just in the seeing. And it was impossible. Right? And it wasn't until years later that I began to raise the question, well, what on earth do I mean by seeing? Is there such a thing as seeing without the rest of, could you have like a living organism that has absolutely no sensitivity except for light? A living being that sees is part of it. So in the seeing, there's just the seeing. What might this mean? To give yourself to the fullness of seeing. Right? Which is affected by, like I interpret what I see by what I hear. I interpret what I hear through what I can touch. I'm interpreting all of this according to kind of past remembrances of prior sensings. At one time it was pure sensing, and then later on it's a memory of sensing. So when it's the memory of sensing, it's no longer sensing, it's now thought. Okay? It's like we're being invited to take this much, much further, to question it. Not like I need to stop sensing in order to just in the seeing there's the seeing, right? But to, we try it, we do what we can with it, but somewhere along the line we realize it just doesn't go anywhere. It's a dead end. And we start to go, well, how do I move as a fully integrated being that I am, engaging? I don't know. I'm interested in finding out. I know. I could Google it. That's how I could find out. Or maybe actually I find out by consulting the direct experience of my living. Right? And that doesn't mean that we don't have inspirations coming from Google, right? Or from other people and so on. But in the crunch, it's integrated into this living. Right? To use the senses to further awakening, explore Dharma, and to come to know the world more profoundly and more compassionately. And we start to notice like how powerful the senses are in many beings for triggering negative emotions and unhelpful attitudes. You know, what's that? You just sort of a smell or something. You know, I mean, this is partly good. Partly good. You know, it's very quiet here, especially in the early morning. Really, really quiet. You can kind of, and today it was very still, so you could hear things really. And Michael just happened to drop a little, there was a breadboard and it just got tipped over and it kind of fell into the sink and it went a clank. And we're up at our house having breakfast. And I could just hear this sound, but it was kind of magnified by the stillness. And I thought, oh God, the ladder's broken. He's just fallen down. I was rushing down to the hut, expecting to, possibly see this poor person lying on the floor, mangled up. And it was just this kind of little thing, And so, I mean, we make these guesses all the time, and we act in response to our sensing. Sometimes that could be, oh, never mind. It's just sound. There's just in the hearing, there's hearing. It's just a big, complete smash up. Never mind. It's just suffering. This is dying. This detachment. Right? Obviously, we're caught in this, right? But can I, is it compassionate? What's to come to know the world more profoundly and more compassionately? It doesn't say anything about coming to know the world accurately. Like this is the fundamental truth. Because it's murmurating, remember? Those of you who weren't here last week or last Sunday, you miss out on this. It's like the whole thing's in flux and movement and everything's responding to everything. Right? I will train myself through listening deeply and speaking truthfully to communicate in a skillful and compassionate manner. Right? What do I mean by listening deeply? When I'm having a conversation with someone else, can you notice there could be a difference between listening shallowly or superficially and listening deeply. One person says something, you respond to what they say, and you both depart unsatisfied because there was no communication. And in another situation where the person says something, you don't have a clue what they're talking about, but you respond to their talking in a certain way, and you both go your separate ways later on feeling deeply satisfied and fulfilled. Okay? But the listening is like, how do we listen? Can we listen with our empathy? Can we listen with our feeling? Can we listen with the whole of our body? Can I listen with my memories? As if there was a kind of a field of shimmering potential memories that might be triggered by this interaction. Right? And I'm kind of like really sensitive with this. And you're really there. Right? This whole question of we are very kind of verbal beings. We talk. You noticed? Much more. Our cat doesn't talk much. Our cat lived with us for like nearly 1.5 years before she discovered, seemingly, that talking was useful. Because she lived wild for a long time, and there was no need to talk to humans, so she never said anything. Right? Never occurred to her, but I just imagine she's kind of looking and she's noticing that Mary and I are going blah, 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 and there seems to be action that goes along with these sounds. And sometimes the action smells like meat, right? Or little crunchies in the afternoon, right? And so then I began to notice that she started to come in and go, meow, meow, right? And then as soon as she see you going for the food, she'd shut up and just trot along. She doesn't need to say anything anymore. You know, like this cat's learning, like that we, you know, cats themselves don't need that kind of communication. But are you okay? Are you enjoying yourself, Anne? Are you feeling okay? Yeah, is this okay now? We go back and forth. You know, it's kind of like we're walking down the street and we're constantly sending little messages. You're like silver eyes or little tiny birds that go in flocks in bushes. You know, and they go chip 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 chip, and they can't. You know, and so we speculate that they're using this kind of sound to kind of, are you there? Yes, I'm here. I'm okay. Is it all okay? Yeah, it's all okay. Beep, 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 beep. If it's suddenly one of them goes silent, something wrong. You know, and human beings are a bit like that. Sometimes if we go silent, your well-meaning friends might come and think that there's something terribly wrong. Are you depressed? It's almost like you turned off your little, are you there? I'm here. I see you there. And you're back and forth. Right? So recognizing that this is inseparably part of being the creature that we are. We are gregarious creatures that hang out and yak. And we're so kind of talkative that we don't even mind if there's no one there to talk to. We just continue on by ourselves. Right? You know, you can be sitting in meditation, you can be telling somebody else all about your experience. Right? Mentally. Giving a play-by-play description like Foster Hewitt announcing the National Hockey League games back when I was a kid, and we used to listen to the hockey on the radio. He's coming down the ice, he shoots, he scores! And they get really excited about it. And it made sense to me because we listened to the radio, and on the radio he was recreating the excitement of being in the arena. But then they started televising the shows. But the commentators kept on, and you're watching, you can see the guy coming down the ice, you see him shooting, and you see him scoring. And meanwhile, someone's yelling and screaming, he's coming down the ice, he shoots, he scores! Right? She's breathing in, she's breathing out. Wandering thought. Call in the thought police. Right? Wandering thought, right? Bad meditator, good meditator. Oh, you're very close to enlightenment. Maybe this is in Samadhi, right? Right? Blah, 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 blah. And it can get very, very quiet, right? And because, you know, in a sense you go like, does it ever stop? You know, you're sitting there and you're just observing quietly and listening and settling into the earth, enjoying the garden. And just the very fact that you're enjoying seeing that bee on that flower means that the verbalization is still there very quietly. Right? It's not a distraction though, it's quite beautiful. Nothing wrong with that. Right? It's kind of our thoughts are in tune with the situation. Right? But there's times when our thoughts are not in tune with the situation. Then we got a problem. I will train myself to listen deeply. It used to be I will train myself to communicate in a skillful and compassionate manner. And I had the kind of sinking feeling over the years of working with that kind of phraseology that people thought this was just about how they spoke. But actually we communicate as much through listening as we do. You can't have speaking without listening. Speaking without listening is silence. You know, it's Berkeley's thing about, you know, if the tree falls down in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, did it make a sound? It's kind of like a philosophical conundrum, whether there's sound there if nobody hears this, no creature hears the sound. Okay? And so, you know, our listening is part of, we're communicating. The precept isn't about listening and speaking, it's about communicating, right? We kind of we kind of structurally couple. When we talk and listen to each other, we're actually structurally coupling the dancing of our nervous system, of our skeletal muscular system. Don't know how that worked on the screen, but in the room here, there was just a kind of varying degrees of little movement. You know, you saw the muscles moved, right, and so on. There's right, and not only that, but I'm watching your response, and this is actually contributing to where the air and the vocal cords is vibrating in the next moment. Right? I'm not sure if you're a ventriloquist and I'm just the puppet sitting on your knee, giving the class. Right? Now, who's doing the speaking? The listener or the speaker? The communicating. Right? And slowly we begin to raise the possibility that actually there's an interbeing nature of this. That when we're speaking with another and listening to another, we're kind of linking with them in deep and profound ways. You know, what ways is the linking part of the hearing, and what ways isn't it? In other words, where's the edge of hearing, of listening? And when we explore this way, the interbeingness gets bigger and bigger, appears to get bigger. Our appreciation of the interbeingness expands. Right? I will train myself to listen deeply. How many sounds can you hear right now? Or put in another way, what kind of sensitivity is dancing your being right now? And so part of this training is to really, really consciously be willing to give more attentiveness, right, to listening, and to speak truthfully. And this is like, you know, in this age of no truth, of fake news, this is massive. What do we mean by true? Well, we have to go back to our refuge prayer, don't we? We took refuge in truth. My refuge is to live within the true. This suchness that we are. This thusness that is. To speak truthfully. You know, in a sense, to communicate in a skillful and compassionate manner. Right? In other words, to facilitate life and that more abundantly. And this is a big one because we've got a lot of habit patterns that just goes chuntering on, blabbing, even when we're not really needing to say anything. Okay? And it's not a matter of like not saying anything, but it's a recognition that we are sending ripples out through the universe continuously through this. It's part and parcel of what we are. Can we, is it worthy of exploring more deeply and being more kind of consciously attuned to? I will find the last one. These are all to do with wholesome relating. Right? Sila-parami. This is wholesome relating through the interbeingness of all living beings. Right? That kind of wholesome relating. Wholesome relating through generosity, giving and receiving. Right? Wholesome relating through sensitivity, sensitive responsiveness. Right? Wholesome relating through communication. Calm with union-cation, right? So communication is to make union, to make a kind of temporary integrated system called, from a third person's point of view, two people in conversation. Okay? There's a kind of, at that moment, there's a kind of a union. Okay? And then the last one, right? Training wholesome relating through consumption. And this is so massive on the planet right now. Right? Those who are concerned with the kind of ecological state of affairs, it's just so clear that we just cannot have 8 billion human beings living the kind of life of consumption that the wealthiest people on the planet are living. It would take more than 3 planets to produce such the material. You know, it's just like, it's not possible, this. Right? And consumption is something which is bad. Right? I mean, in the olden days, before cancer came along and became popularized, I'm being slightly facetious, but not really. It's, if you look historically, you see it's almost like there are historical periods where certain illnesses, everyone has them, and that's where all the focus of attention goes. And then it passes. And they used to have a disease called consumption. It was tuberculosis, wasn't it? Right? So as I say, we used to be really, so that's why I say consumption's bad, because nobody thought tuberculosis is not good. It's bad. I will train myself to be ever more directly aware of how nutriment affects the mind and body. What kind of nutriment does my mind take? Okay? How is this nutriment, material, emotional, and so forth, right, mental, affecting my mind? How does it nurture my mind state? Okay? How does this mental thing that I'm taking in nurture my physical state? Right? This is so much more than just what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. Right? I will train myself to become aware of what it does, to really recognize this. Right? People say, "Oh, what kind of diet should I do?" Well, sometimes we suggest, I could be dismissive kind of thing. It's she's just looking for recipes and so on, right? Find out for yourself. But then sometimes I'm not dismissive and I give a really reasonable answer, which is, well, just maybe diminish your consumption quite radically for a little while. It's called a fast, right? And then add maybe one food at a time. Just put it in your mouth and feel it in your mouth and don't swallow it. And then if at that point, after you fasted for a while, you're quite sensitive, right? And you feel you want to eat it, swallow it. But if you kind of put it in your mouth and you go, I don't think I want to eat it, spit it out. And actually use the sensitivity of your organism to identify what is nurturing for you today. And I remember a very sad but quite instructive story I heard of a toddler. Couldn't have been a toddler. It'd be a young boy. I think it was in North America, and somehow he picked up a glass of boiling water and guzzled it before there was the recognition that he was drinking boiling water. And burnt, like burns all down through the esophagus and so on. It was terrible, right? And they rushed him into hospital, and they had to put a tube somewhere into his stomach to feed him, because for quite a period of time, for the healing, he couldn't take any food down his esophagus. And he was losing weight, and they were giving him a completely balanced diet. He was eating all the nutritious diets. You got so many vitamins and so many trace elements, and you got this and you got that, so much carbohydrate, so much protein. It's all perfectly balanced according to the knowledge of medical science. The boy was wasting away, right? And then later on, some nurse, usually the hero in this piece is always a nurse, right? And she had this kind of brilliant idea of asking the boy what he wanted to eat, right? And the boy somehow communicated that what he really wanted was a Big Mac. Junk food. You wanted junk food. So not only did the nurse have the wisdom to ask, but she also had the wisdom to act. And so she went out and bought a Big Mac, and they put it in a blender, right? And blended it down into goop, poured it down the tube into the boy's stomach, and put a tiny amount of the Big Mac in his mouth, even though he couldn't swallow anything. Right? But he could taste it. Right? And he slowly started to gain weight and get healthy. Right? So for him, Big Mac was nutritious nutriment. But also pleasure was nutriment. It wasn't just was it the food that was nurturing him, or was it the pleasure of having that food? I think I was just kind of contemplating the story of this woman that I just read today, with long COVID, who said she hasn't had any taste or smell for 2.5 years. She was one of the earliest people to get COVID. And she said it was quite mild. She didn't have a really terrible thing. The only thing is she lost her smell and her taste, and it never came back. And they're kind of speculating that, is that something, did the virus get into part of the brain and doing something, or is it getting into the olfactory nerve things themselves? And she couldn't even tell the difference between salt and sugar and the basic taste. She's thinking, how can you live like that? It's really challenging to live like that. And so, I will train myself to be ever more directly aware of how nutriment affects the mind and body. First of all, because this is a contemplation, we're asking, what is nutriment? Right? How many kind of flavors of nutriment can I identify? And you begin to realize you eat feelings. You eat meat, or you eat vegetables, or you eat fruit, but you also eat feelings and concepts. Kind of, you know what I mean? They nourish us. Okay? I was like, we're raising the question of what all living beings. The Buddha once said, "What is the one?" It was kind of a Buddhist catechism. And then the answer came, all beings live by nutriment. It's the one great truth. Right? And so, when we start to see it's inescapable that nutriment is not an option. I can't say, well, I'm not going to deal with that nutriment. I'll just fast. Right? It's like, what nurtures my being? What invites flowering of body, speech, and mind? Okay? Can I really start to look into this deeply? I will eat and drink and nurture myself and others. Because increasingly, if I can start to really nurture myself, I might be able to nurture others. It's exceedingly difficult to nurture others without nurturing yourself. Okay? You don't look after yourself. How can you? Your fundamental knowledge of how to look after someone is from looking after yourself. I will eat and drink and nurture myself and others in ways that support awakening. Again, this question is might as well leave the word awakening, bodhi, right? But it's really important that we continuously, gently allow the possibility of expanding and transforming our understanding of what we mean by awakening. So this is we've got, I take refuge in wisdom, Prajna, right? Compassion, skillful means, Samadhi, like just one-pointedly, we're training, all the meditation work is to be one-pointedly samadhied on skillful means. There is no other meditation, right? We could say it's, we have sublime understanding instead of wisdom, and we could say immeasurable love. That's the samadhi. Just one-pointedly on that. All the others are just details. If you don't have immeasurable love when you're samadhiing on your breath, I wonder if you're really with your breath. No interest, no caring for it, no, right? This is there. And then we have non-clinging awareness, which is the dance of the relating. In terms of and because that's so complex, in the 6 parami we divide it up into 4, right? And we have generosity, Dharma-parami, Sila-parami, which is what we're emphasizing today, and then patience and skilled use of energy. And I really invite you all, everyone, both people who we're meeting on the screen and people in the room, to invite you to use these wholesome life trainings. They're trainings in wholesome living, in living wholly, like with wholeness. Right? And actually blend them with your sort of formal practice, so to speak, to the point where you can't really tell where one begins and the other one ends off. Okay? And in this sense, we begin to live this way. We begin to actually live how would an eco-sattva live? This is how a growing, budding, apprentice eco-sattva, right? Learning the art of being a living being on this planet in this sector of the galaxy. This is how we would live. And there's so much nowadays. People want to turn Dharma into a thing of either techniques or bits of information. So you get information knowledge, you sit in umpteen hours of classes and collect tons of information knowledge, right? Or you sit down and you do your meditation practice, right? And it's almost like, the rest of it's kind of becomes, for many people, I think as soon as you start getting into these 5 Wholesome Life Trainings, or a more traditional way from a Buddhist perspective, they talk about 5 training precepts, right? In a positive expression, this one, rather than the I will not take life, I will not be stingy, I will not lie and be deceitful, right? I will not abuse the senses, I will not take drugs and drink alcohol and do bad stuff with my eating. It's much more than that, right? This is what I will do. I'm going to embrace this. Right? And there's people say, well, yeah, that's just kind of the Buddhist stuff. I'm more interested in just the technique. I just want to kind of see what's actually there. I'm doing Vipassana meditation. I'm just seeing what's actually there. But actually, it's not possible to see what's actually there without being actually there. And increasingly we realize that there's no separation between the kind of almost the most ordinary aspects of our living and the most profound aspects of prajna, sublime understanding, looking into this dancing of interbeing, these murmurations of everything and everyone, responding to each other, and we go, and here we are. And this, now I'll just speak kind of personally, this to me, knowing this, feeling this, I don't mean now I know this all the time. In the day, it kind of webs, it comes up and it comes down, there's strong points and lesser points, faded, there's like, but when this is like really clear, and it's increasingly clear, that to me, I know no other blessing. This is it. This living, this mystery that somehow we're privileged to be part of for as long as we're part of it. Would you like to say anything, anyone, or raise any questions? I've just stopped looking at, I've just done a Tarchin. I really need a great big clock that I can't avoid, right? These you people, we get a chance to talk afterwards anyway. Yeah. For those of you that are not here with us, is there anyone who feels moved to say anything now? If you could unmute or something, and a contribution from another part of the world.
Hi Tarchin, it's Bill.
Hello, Bill.
I'm on the first of the life trainings.
Yep.
I'll train myself to support and appreciate the life of all living beings.
Yes.
I'm interested, it seems to me the appreciate is a big one, in the sense that...
Still there?
Yeah.
It's all right, I just dropped my laptop on the ground. I was trying to dial up your sound.
Just in the sense of the appreciate, there's a quality of joy that seems to me to be not emphasized. Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that it's important.
Oh, don't get distracted, Bill. Joy, I mean, that's suspicious, yeah.
It also goes to that, it's beyond the intellect. Like, it's that felt kinesthetic quality of, like, there's a enlivening or an enriching or something that seems to me to be so important.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, Bhadra.
Just want to comment on something. My experience at the moment, I won't put a percentage on it, but I've been being with you and being with the being, and I saw your computer starting to fall before you saw it.
Yes.
And I jumped like that.
Yes.
It kind of clicked me out of
yes.
my beingness.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment on that.
Well, can I perhaps just make a comment on your comment, right?
Sure.
The possibility that it didn't click you out of your beingness, there was just a shift in the flow of your beingness, right? And Rinpoche used to say that the idea of samadhi, meaning that you're sort of in a continuum state of goodness or blessedness or something, is missing the point. He says much more to the point is how quickly you can recognize that you've sort of fallen out of a more functional state, how quickly you can recognize that and then reconnect with a more functional state, right? And there's nothing wrong with kind of having a jump when something like this happens, right? But sometimes there is. You know what I mean? Like imagine you're not driving a car right now. I don't know, if you somehow create the same situation, you're driving in the car and I'm sitting in the passenger seat and somehow the laptop falls or something and you have the same reaction and at that moment when you're having the reaction there, the car turns slightly and we run into a telephone pole. Not good. Right? It was kind of, so, but here, it's kind of, it's not life-threatening. Okay, I had a shock, or I had a thing, and then I go, oh. And then I recognize I come back. And there's in this kind of my kind of recent medical journeys, I have many moments that aren't that great, but I do find that it doesn't kind of linger for a long time before something shifts, and I just kind of, you kind of get on with the bigger wonder again. You get knocked out of it, then you recognize it, and then you return. Right? Eventually, imagine for a moment you're such a poor meditator that in 1 hour sitting your mind wandered 100 times from the breath. And you know, because you counted each one of them. That's amazing awareness. You know what I mean? It's like not a fantasy of samadhi, but a reality of skillful means of living in a dancing universe in which none of us chose for the laptop to slip onto the floor there. Right? I mean, in a sense, it wasn't, I was doing a genuinely reasonable thing to do, which was trying to dial up the sound so that we could hear Bill. And in the process of all of this, it slipped. So something bad came out of a good intention. Or does it have to be something bad that came out of a good intention? It just, in the end, it really helps to be able to go, well, stuff happens. Right? When it's somebody else, be concerned for them. But when it happens for yourself, just go, laugh a bit, stuff happens. Right? Remind yourself of goodness and get on with it. Right? And this is and we're learning the skill of living well, in recognizing that there will always be interruptions that are outside of our control. I'd like to stop now. It's been a rather long morning. Thank you all for joining us. And I hope that although we're covering what some people might call is extremely basic Buddhist teaching, this is just beginner stuff. And I'm hoping that you're able to hear this just basic beginner stuff in a fresh way that feels deeply meaningful for you. Right? By the power of these wholesome activities, may our lives be rich with awakening. Living thus, may we abandon all unwholesomeness. In the very midst of this continuous murmurating, right, of life and living in all its interbeingness, may we help ourselves and all beings to realize their true interbeing nature. Sarva Mangalam, Sarva Mangalam, Sarva Mangalam. Thank you, thank you, thank you.